From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Kaylee Lyons. House Republicans reach a Plan B, a new deal to keep the government funded beyond midnight Friday, which has the blessing of President-elect Donald Trump. We'll have more live from Capitol Hill this hour. Republican Congressman Tom McClintock of California and Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois will join me, as well as our political panel. Plus, we'll bring you a conversation with outgoing Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who sat down with Bloomberg's David Gura for a conversation on the Middle East, Ukraine, and more. Thanks for joining on this Thursday evening. We begin with House Republicans having reached a new stopgap agreement to extend government funding beyond the midnight Friday deadline and suspend the federal debt limit for 2 years. President-elect Trump has thrown his support behind the measure, calling it, quote, a very good deal for the American people, in a post on Truth Social. But it's not clear whether the bill can garner Democratic support, with the House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries calling the proposal not serious and laughable. Joining me now from Capitol Hill for more on this measure's prospects is Republican Congressman Tom McClintock of California. Congressman, thank you for being here on Bloomberg. I understand that you are a yes to this continuing resolution while you weren't for the first one. Other than the fact that this is much shorter, we're talking less than 120 pages here compared to over 1,500. What got you there?
Well, there's still a lot I don't like about it. I think that the disaster appropriation is excessive. I hate the farm subsidies, and I don't like the blanket debt extension. But here's what's the overwhelming factor for me, and that is I want Donald Trump to succeed. He believes that this is necessary in order to set up his administration. It's outset for success, and that weighs very heavily in my calculations.
Well, and certainly the president-elect had been advocating for either a lifting of the debt ceiling or suspending it entirely before he lifts office. Even if you are willing to vote for this to help his future success, Congressman, how many of your colleagues do you think might not be able to swallow this particular measure? And I guess the following question after that is how many Democrats would need to sign on?
Well, I can't read minds and I can't tell fortunes, but I can tell you this. Every Republican in the House of Representatives, and I believe every Republican in the Senate, wants Donald Trump to succeed. I believe that is going to carry the day, either through a suspension vote tonight if Democrats join us, or through a rules vote tomorrow if they don't.
Well, as you talk about the success that you would like to see unimpeded for Donald Trump, do you see Elon Musk as playing a role potentially in disrupting that? It seemed to a lot of us yesterday as though Elon Musk was getting ahead of the president-elect with his pushback against this measure. What role should he be playing in this when he is not a democratically elected representative like you are?
Well, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and the entire Doge team carries enormous credibility when it comes to cutting excess spending. They have no official role, but their influence is enormous, and they give credibility to the president-elect when he says that by raising the debt limit over the next 2 years, we're giving him the time to put in the reforms that are necessary to put us back on a course to fiscal responsibility. So I think Musk and Ramaswamy and the Doge team give the president enormous credibility in asking for passage of this bill today.
Well, as we consider their objectives in the incoming administration, we do know legislatively the president-elect would like to see a lot done, including border and energy measures and, of course, ultimately a massive tax reform package. As you well know, sir, I'm sure there is conversation as to whether or not it should be 2 budget reconciliation packages or 1 big one. Just given the difficulty with which keeping the government open past tomorrow at midnight has proven to be, how confident are you that you could get through 2 reconciliation packages early in Trump's term when your majority that you are part of is going to be even smaller than it is now?
Well, the reconciliation process is a brilliant system that can bring spending in line with revenue when it's used properly. And that is that both houses have to agree to a budget resolution with top-line numbers on both the discretionary and the mandatory side. The appropriators are bound by the discretionary numbers. The individual committees are then sent reconciliation instructions to change the laws in order to bring mandatory spending into line. It hasn't been used that way for 30 years, but it's there as a very important tool. And as far as getting a consensus around those numbers, that requires what this whole building is about. Deliberation, coming together, talking these issues out, sitting in the same room and yelling at each other until we come to a common conclusion. That's the whole essence of the legislative process. And I always have had great confidence in that when it's used properly, when it's used as it was designed.
Do you still have confidence in House Speaker Mike Johnson to lead that process in the 119th Congress, given the events of the last few days?
I think he's done the best he can with the hand he's been dealt. And when we talk about replacing him with another speaker, you've got to find someone in his right mind who wants that job. And anybody who wants that job is by definition not in his right mind. So I think Mike is going to remain as speaker.
But do you think it could take multiple rounds of voting to get him there in January, like we saw with his predecessor, Kevin McCarthy?
Again, sadly, I was born without the powers of prophecy. I can't answer that question. Ask me the day after it happens.
Well, fair enough, sir. Hopefully you can answer this next one, as you are chair of the subcommittee on immigration, integrity, security, and enforcement in the House Judiciary Committee. And we also know that among one of the first things Donald Trump would like to address is immigration, as he's promised mass deportations, which, as we all also are aware, could be a very expensive endeavor and difficult to pull off. From your perch, do you have any concerns about the way in which this may be conducted, or if it can be done as expediently as the president-elect would like?
No, it's a very simple matter of actually enforcing the laws. If we're not going to enforce our immigration laws, we have no immigration laws. If we have no immigration laws, we have no border. And if we have no border, we have no country. This nation has suffered the worst illegal mass migration in recorded history. Very few nations that I'm aware of down through history have survived such an event as we are now in. I met with Tom Homan and a number of other members of the House today, and he is absolutely dedicated to enforcing the law. That is as simple as it can get. It's going to be very expensive. It's going to require many, many months. But I believe that it has to happen if we're going to restore the integrity of our nation's borders and our nation's sovereignty.
Congressman, before we let you go, and I don't want to ask you to be a prophet again, but does your gut instinct tell you this new continuing resolution can pass on the first try if it does indeed come to a vote this evening, or will it have to go through the Rules Committee?
Well, again, it'll be taken up this evening on a suspension vote. That requires 2/3 of those present and voting. If it fails on that, then it will be presented to the House tomorrow under a rule, which requires a simple majority vote.
All right, I guess we'll see how this one goes. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us live from Capitol Hill this evening. Republican Congressman Tom McClintock of California. And still ahead, we'll get reaction to this new funding agreement from the other chamber. Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois is next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. If the House is able to pass the new slimmed-down continuing resolution to extend government funding that was just released, it will still have to pass the Senate before it can head to President Biden's desk for a signature as they try to keep the lights on beyond midnight tomorrow. Joining me now from Capitol Hill for more on the bill's prospects in the upper chamber is Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who serves as the majority whip. Senator, thank you very much for your time this evening. This is obviously a much smaller bill. I'm not sure that you've had time to look through all 116 pages, but based on what we know so far, are you willing to whip votes for this?
It's way too soon to say that. When they asked Speaker Johnson, did you consult with the Democrats when you wrote this new bill? He said no. He's going to go it alone. Well, you can do that sometimes if you have everybody lined up when you have a thin majority. But in this case, we'll just wait and see what happens this evening.
Well, as we consider what could happen this evening, knowing we're working against a deadline of tomorrow, sir, would you and the Senate leadership consider changing whatever legislation is able to pass the House, or is it not worth risking a shutdown just ahead of the holidays for federal employees?
Well, of course we want to avoid a shutdown. This never should have happened this way. The reason it shouldn't have is that we've been working for weeks, if not months, on a bipartisan agreement that we had last night, which should have been called for a vote in both chambers, and I think it would have passed. But the decision was made at the last minute by Elon Musk and Donald Trump that they wanted to end this conversation and stop this bipartisan effort, and they did it last night. So here we are stuck in the last few hours before the shutdown with this predicament.
Would you encourage your colleagues in the House to vote for this measure to keep the lights on, though, or should Hakeem Jeffries hold firm and not provide a single vote?
Well, I can just tell you that 2 hours ago we hadn't even seen this proposal. So this notion, if you're asking me, am I ready to whip this and say you should vote for it, Democrat or Republican? For goodness sakes, we should have been in on the conversation creating it, but at a minimum we should have the time to evaluate it before we're called on to endorse it or to oppose it.
Well, that's fair enough, sir, and I do appreciate how condensed a timeline we are working with here. Everybody is getting new information very quickly and not a lot of time to process it. I do, though, want to consider the idea that this bill would raise the debt ceiling for 2 years. This is something that Donald Trump started pushing for yesterday, either lifting the debt ceiling or abolishing it entirely. And I would note, Senator, that just last week, you co-sponsored and introduced legislation, the End the Threat of the Default Act, which would repeal the debt ceiling. So is this an area in which you could see yourself working with the president-elect on when he comes into office?
You put your finger on the key element in this new proposal from the Republicans, and that is suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years. Why would this be so important? Donald Trump, in his first term, with his tax cuts for the wealthiest in America, ended up adding more debt to the national debt of the United States in 4 years than any other president in history. When you give these tax cuts to wealthy people at these levels, it really takes it out of the Treasury. Now he's going to do it again because the bill is up for reauthorization. He wants to extend and expand his tax cut for wealthy people, and he doesn't want to face the criticism that he's adding dramatically to our national debt. And so he suspends the debt ceiling for 2 years. We won't talk about that issue, but that's what's behind it. Unfortunately, if we're going to change the tax code, we should do it for people who definitely need it, working families and children.
Well, that is obviously just one battle that will lie ahead in the new year, sir, when you become a member of the minority rather than the Senate majority. And I do wonder to what extent that I know you do, sir. I know you do. I wonder to what extent you think Senator John Thune, the incoming majority leader, like we've seen House Speaker Mike Johnson have to navigate for the last several days, is actually going to be just as beholden to Elon Musk as to the president of the United States.
Well, I hope not. For goodness sakes, John Thune is a respected colleague of mine in the Senate. We disagree on a whole lot of issues, but I respect him personally, and I would look forward to working with him and hope that we could do some good for this nation. But if the shots are going to be called by Elon Musk, the wealthiest man in the world who has his own personal and financial agenda, then I'm afraid that's not in the best interest of the United States. We didn't elect him. He doesn't hold elected office. The people who do have that responsibility.
Well, among your various responsibilities, sir, in addition to being the whip, you also chair the Judiciary Committee. And I do have a few questions for you in that regard, as President Biden, who is still sitting in the Oval Office, has threatened to veto the Judges Act, which passed unanimously in the Senate over the summer and then passed the House. This would expand the federal judiciary. But given the timing with which the House has passed this measure, are you supportive of that veto? And are you worried that even if President Biden shoots this down, it could get revived under the Trump administration and give him more appointive power?
Well, it's possible. Anything is possible in the future. The problem we had was we moved early on this proposal for a specific reason. We wanted Democrats and Republicans to vote on it before the outcome of this last election was known. And so you didn't know who would have the political advantage, Democrats or Republicans. Well, it turns out that President Trump prevailed and his party prevailed. And so this notion of being in neutral territory, the magic moment before the election, was gone. And so at this point, it's a partisan decision on his part to have some 22 extra judges to appoint. And you can understand that on the Democratic side, we're not applauding that possibility.
Well, I'm sure, though, you are applauding the more than 230 members of the judiciary who have been confirmed under this administration thus far. And I do wonder, though, as we look to the future, knowing those confirmations are in hand and Donald Trump will have the power to be appointing more over the next 4 years, how politically vulnerable you see the judiciary as becoming.
Well, the 235, if the last two are approved, and I hope they will be on the Senate floor, the 235 judges we've secured over the last 4 years, 85% plus of them were on bipartisan votes. They represent 1/4 of the federal judiciary, so it's a pretty significant decision. I worked with President Trump in his first term in my state of Illinois to find judges we could both agree on. They weren't my first choices and maybe not his either, but we found an agreement. I hope we can do the same thing in the future.
And, Senator, one final question for you related to the Supreme Court. It announced yesterday that it will hear arguments in the TikTok case on January 10th, just 9 days before the deadline that would see it banned, if not divested, in the U.S. takes effect. Considering this was a bipartisan law passed by Congress, if the Supreme Court were to rule in favor of the company in this instance, what would that do to congressional authority?
Well, of course, it raises a question as to who has the final word. And we have to understand that what those actions that were taken in the context of our belief in what the Constitution says when it comes to free speech and free press. So it's up to the Supreme Court to have the final word, as they do so often. We could be happy with the results, or the opposite may be true. But we do want to make it clear that when it comes to the national security of the United States, we've told the people at TikTok, your alliance and involvement with China worries us. And we think it is a real concern that the information you're gathering about private information on American citizens, that will continue, and I hope will be reflected in that Supreme Court decision.
All right, well, we'll find out come January. Democratic Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, chair of the Judiciary Committee and Majority Whip, thank you for your time this evening, sir.
Thank you, too.
Coming up, we'll take a closer look at the impact Elon Musk and Donald Trump have had on the government funding process with Bloomberg's Nancy Cook. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. As we've told you, there is a new agreement for a continuing resolution to keep the government funded, and President-elect Donald Trump has shown his support for the measure. Elon Musk arguably has as well, seemingly retweeting or reposting on X his support. Musk, of course, led the way in denouncing the first deal and the killing of Plan A. So joining me now for more is Bloomberg's Nancy Cook. Nancy, you're obviously very plugged into the Trump camp, and I do have to wonder if all of this came out of nowhere or could have been more predictable, perhaps, especially his insistence that emerged really yesterday that the debt ceiling needed to be dealt with before he takes office.
Yeah, I just think, so in Mar-a-Lago, there has been quite a lot of discussion about sort of what next year will look like legislatively. And it's still really in the nascent stage. But I do think the debt ceiling came from a lot of chatter among Trump aides about sort of what the first 100 days will look like and what they'll be able to get done. And, you know, they really want to do an immigration, energy, and border security bill first. They also want to do tax reform next year. Those are two huge sweeping bills. And a lot of the Trump aides and advisors I've talked to have raised concerns sort of within that context about sort of putting a debt ceiling bill in there, too. And so I think that that's where it came from. Like, it's sort of been something they've been discussing. And then suddenly Trump saw an opening to maybe try to nudge the House Republicans to deal with it now so that they don't have to deal with it when he's actually in office next year.
I'd also wonder if the president-elect was ready for this opening to open up, in that before we heard from Donald Trump or J.D. Vance on this continuing resolution, we were hearing from Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy repeatedly, then Don Jr. Did they all get ahead of the president on this one, or were they always singing from the same book?
Well, the Trump people will say, you know, Trump always knows what Elon's going to tweet. But I think that's just not the case. And I think what ended up happening, which is what often happens with Trump, is one of his, advisors will see something and deem it not, sufficiently MAGA enough, or he'll see something on Fox News and then will react to that. And then suddenly we have a policy position. And I think that's partly what happened here. We've had Elon reacting to it. This morning I watched a bunch of Fox and Friends to try to, catch the wind, where the wind was going to blow. It sort of became a talking point very, very quickly. And the House Republicans had to react because Trump is really leading the party now. And what he says goes.
Well, and something else he's saying today, and it kind of echoes what we were seeing Elon Musk say yesterday, which was anyone who voted for the first continuing resolution shouldn't be in office in 2 years, a.k.a. we're going to primary you. Donald Trump on Truth Social today talked about Chip Roy, who, if we all recall back in the primary campaign, backed DeSantis over Donald Trump. He said Chip Roy is just another ambitious guy with no talent, going on to say, I hope some talented challengers are getting ready in the great state of Texas to go after Chip in the primary. He won't have a chance. How real are these threats, Nancy?
Well, I think they are real. I mean, I think with Joni Ernst, for instance, who was raising a lot of concerns about Pete Hegseth's nomination for Secretary of Defense, they sent Charlie Kirk, a very key MAGA advocate, out to Iowa to sort of rattle the cages there and remind her that she too could be primaried. So they're really using this threat across the board for legislative achievements they want, for Senate confirmations. They're sort of saying, if you defy us, we will come back and try to primary you. Trump, though, also has a vibe, but you have to remember, where he can get mad at people and forgive them. We've seen him do that a bunch of times with Steve Bannon, for instance, even with Ron DeSantis. He's sort of okay with him at this point. So people can come back. They can cycle back into the Trump orbit.
Just quickly, we just have a minute left here, but on January 3rd, when Speaker Johnson has to run to be Speaker again, is he going to have the full backing of Donald Trump, or does it depend on how the next 24 hours go?
It really depends on how really the next 24 hours go. Even Trump himself, said today, we'll have to see.
Indeed, we will. And Bloomberg's Nancy Cook will be on top of it, as always. Thank you so much for joining me. And still ahead here on Balance of Power, we'll bring you Bloomberg's David Gura, who sat down with Secretary of State Antony Blinken this morning for a wide-ranging conversation that covered the Middle East, Ukraine, and, of course, the future of foreign policy as we get set for this next administration. And just some breaking news from Donald Trump. He just posted again on Truth Social, saying that to cut spending next year through reconciliation, or the U.S. should be doing that, hundreds of billions of dollars in spending. And again, this comes down to the debt ceiling questions and Elon Musk. So we'll have more ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kaylee Lyons. Earlier today, Bloomberg's David Gura sat down with outgoing U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. They discussed how the State Department is preparing for the next administration, as well as the state of geopolitics. Their conversation began with the change in power in Syria and the U.S.'s goals in the region.
What we've heard them say is positive. The question is, what are they actually going to do? We brought together with Jordan countries from around the region last week. We had Turkey, we had Iraq, we had the Gulf states, Jordan, Egypt, European partners. And we came together to set expectations. What is the international community? What are the neighbors looking for as this transition takes place in Syria? And we all agreed. We want to see something that's inclusive, that's non-sectarian, that respects minorities, women, that deals with any chemical weapons that may be remaining in Syria, that doesn't ally with ISIS or any of the terrorist groups that are there. And the reason that's so important is we want to make it clear to HTS and all of the emerging authorities that the recognition that they seek, the support that they seek and need from the international community, well, there's certain expectations that come along with that. And as I said, we've heard positive statements coming from Mr. Jelani, the leader of HTS. But what everyone is focused on is what's actually happening on the ground. What are they doing? Are they working to build a transition in Syria that brings everyone in? If they do that, and if they meet some of these other tests that the international community is looking for them to meet, then I think you can see something very positive. And here's what it is. For the first time in decades, the people of Syria can go forward without a dictator, without a terrorist group dominating their lives, without one sect or one group running things at the exclusion of others, and without foreign power calling all the shots. That's the opportunity, but it really requires HTS and other groups that are there to move forward in this inclusive way.
You've said that the U.S. wants to help, and I look at this country that has a lot of sanctions that are residual. A lot of sanctions have been in place for decades on Syria. Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut has called for a temporary suspension of sanctions. Is that something that you would be amenable to, and would that be effective in helping you have more engagement with what may be this new government? So
we're looking at all the authorities we have. We're looking at all of the sanctions, not only our own. The United Nations has sanctions on HTS, its leader, and I think what we need to see is actual concrete steps, building an inclusive, non-sectarian government, a transition, eventually getting to an election. As we see these steps taken, then I think we'll be able to respond. Others will be able to respond. That's what we'd like to do. But we need to see concrete action, not simply positive declarations.
The EU's chief diplomat has said she's sending a senior representative to Damascus to talk to this new group, talk to this government. Is that something that you would want to do, that you can do, indeed, given the terrorist designation and the sanctions that are in place?
We've actually been in direct contact with HTS.
On the ground?
I can just tell you we've been in direct contact, and we're also looking at getting people on the ground in Syria. I think it's important to have direct communication. It's important to speak as clearly as possible, to listen, to make sure that we understand as best we can where they're going and where they want to go. So we'll be looking at pursuing that in the coming days.
Pull back and ask you another question about the region, and there's been a lot of speculation that a ceasefire deal could come together. When President Biden spoke about the deal between Israel and Hezbollah, he was asked at the end, do you think you can get a ceasefire deal by the end of your tenure? He said he's hoping and praying. Is there anything that's happened that gives more grounds for hope and prayer going forward here?
There is, and the reality is we should logically be able to get this. And I say that with all the caution that comes with that statement, because, you know, we've been very close before, and we've had these Lucy in the football moments where you're just ready to kick the football and Lucy pulls it away. But what's changed is this. Hamas knows that the cavalry is not coming to the rescue. For months and months and months, it hoped it would get a wider war with Hezbollah, with Iran, with Iranian-aligned groups coming in and creating more problems from Israel on more fronts and helping Hamas endure. We now know that's not happening. They know it's not happening because of the very important work that was done with us and with others, dealing with the unprecedented Iranian attacks on Israel, dealing with Hezbollah. So I think that's concentrated minds among Hamas on the need to complete this deal. Having said that, you know, it's always incredibly fraught, and it's very hard to get decisions made. It's hard to communicate. And for all of those reasons, even as close as it is, you know, it can still move in the other direction. But we've all been fanning out, working with all of the different partners who can make a difference and who may have some leverage with, communications with Hamas, whether it's Qatar, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Turkey, where I was just last week. The fundamental question right now is Hamas finally prepared to say yes? And if it does, we get the hostages back. We get a ceasefire. We get an immediate, dramatic improvement in the lives of Palestinian children, women and men who've been caught in this horrible crossfire since October 7th of Hamas's making. If they really purport to care about the Palestinian people, they will say yes and do it now.
Let me ask you about that horrible crossfire, and it's something that you've written about in a recent essay for Foreign Affairs, the fact that millions have been displaced, tens of thousands have been killed, Gaza has been kind of reduced to rubble. You've made 12 trips to the region. How much regret do you have that kind of sustained level of humanitarian aid hasn't made it into Gaza over the course of this conflict?
You know, from day one, we've tried to do several things, going back to October 7th. First, to stand resolute with Israel to try to make sure that October 7th would never happen again. Second, to prevent this war from going wider, because if that happened, if other fronts opened up, whether it was with Iran, whether it was with Hezbollah, these other groups, more death, more destruction, and it would probably prolong what was going on in Gaza. And three, to do whatever we could to make sure that people in Gaza were getting the assistance they need, were getting the protections they need. And we have been on this virtually every single day. And we've seen moments when more assistance was getting through. Then we've seen moments where it's ebbed and flowed. But this has a dramatic effect on the lives and livelihoods of people in Gaza. The last week or 10 days, there has been a noticeable improvement, but we've seen that before, and then we've seen it fall off. The best way to finally deal with the needs of the people would be to end the conflict, would be to get the ceasefire, to get the hostages home. That's the best way, because you have an environment that is unique. You have a population that's trapped in Gaza. It doesn't have anywhere to go. In most other conflicts, people, they can become refugees. That's not a good thing, but it's better than being caught in the middle of a hot war. And also you have an enemy, in the case of Hamas, that's fully enmeshed with the civilian population, living in and under buildings, apartment buildings, schools, mosques, hospitals. That doesn't obviate at all the responsibility that Israel has to try to ensure that assistance gets to people who need it and that people are protected as best possible.
You can find Bloomberg's full conversation with Secretary of State Antony Blinken online or on the terminal. Coming up, House Republicans have formed another funding deal ahead of tomorrow night's deadline, but it's not clear if it will have the support to pass. Our political panel will weigh in next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think that the disaster appropriation is excessive. I hate the farm subsidies, and I don't like the blanket debt extension. But here's what's the overwhelming factor for me, and that is I want Donald Trump to succeed.
Republican Congressman Tom McClintock of California earlier this hour on the pending House Stopgap funding vote could happen less than an hour from now. Joining me now for its prospects is this evening's political panel, Sarah Chamberlain, President and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership and Republican strategist, alongside Christy Setzer, President and founder of New Heights Communications and Democratic strategist. Welcome to you both. It has been another wild day on Capitol Hill, to say the least. Sarah, obviously it took them a bit to hammer this thing out. Now that it's here, how hard is it going to be to hammer it through the chamber?
They will absolutely hammer it through tonight. They want to go home. They actually think this is a great package with a 3-month clean CR, the disaster relief, the farm bill. And what's interesting about this is the raising the debt ceiling to 2027. Even Senator Elizabeth Warren agrees with the Republicans on that. So I'm very confident tonight will be done.
And is it done in the first try when it's suspension of the rules and requires a 2/3 majority, or has to go through the Rules Committee and then try to pass?
I actually think it's going to go through the Rules Committee, which is why I think you saw the X or tweet or whatever from Donald Trump today, President-elect Donald Trump, talking about Chip Roy. Chip Roy is on the committee. He doesn't want Chip Roy to block it. Bob Good did go away. We were instrumental in doing that. And, you know, Chip Roy could go away in 2 years.
Well, Chip Roy has already suggested he's a no, at least on the first vote. There have been others as well, Christy, which raised the question of the math here and whether it would require Democrats to get this thing over the finish line. Do you see a single Democratic member of the House casting a vote for this measure?
The challenge for Democrats is that on one hand, obviously, they do not want to give Donald Trump a victory on this. They don't want to give Speaker Johnson a victory on this. At the same time, Democrats actually believe in government. We have always, I say this every time, always been the adults in the room on these in the past. We are the people who actually believe in giving not just disaster relief, but we actually even believe in something as silly as, I don't know, a childhood cancer research center that would be cut out of this recent bill, right? So you're definitely get Democrats who are inclined to make sure that government will keep working. But that's not the signal they were getting from Hakeem Jeffries today, which said absolutely not. This is a laughable bill. We're not going to go forward with it. I think ultimately, sure, they get a few, and probably it's going to be enough even to counterbalance the few that Republicans are going to lose. But, man, I want my party to put up a good fight on this. I do.
Well, they don't have much time, though, is the problem. The deadline is midnight Friday. So it becomes a question, if this lapses, if we cross that threshold, who is going to shoulder blame here?
Well, if we get it through the House as Republican-controlled and the Democratic Senate blocks it, it's on the Democrats. I mean, we have done what we had to do. It wasn't pretty. It took us a few days, a couple gray hairs, but we got there. And if the Senate doesn't come along with it, it's the Democratic shutdown.
Well, it wasn't pretty, and it did play out quite publicly. I mean, all one has to do is open social media to see a litany of posts from Elon Musk, who very clearly wanted this first plan to tank and did so. So do you think in some way the electorate would assign blame on the ones who took this down, one of which doesn't happen to be a democratically elected member of the U.S. government?
I do, and here's why. There was a deal, as you know, as recently as a couple days ago. It was a bipartisan deal that they've been working on for weeks. This is a problem of Republicans' own making, and specifically, as you said, of someone who's not even a member of Congress who's wanting to take this down. So the fact is that Donald Trump has been acting as though he is the president since Election Day, and I think this is actually something that ends up biting him in the butt because he's been acting like he's the president. I don't think that the average American follows along the intricacies of Congress, as well as obviously anybody at this table. And therefore, I think they feel like, Donald Trump has been making some decisions lately. Government shutting down has got to be his problem.
Well, so when we consider the role of Elon Musk in this, Sarah, how concerned does it make you about legislating under this new world in which not just Donald Trump is president once again, but he has a very close ally in Elon Musk who is clearly willing to be incredibly outspoken about legislative issues?
Well, we'll see how long this goes on. I mean, I'm not really sure how all this dynamic is going to play out. Clearly, though, Elon Musk, he did put that on X. And the bill changed. And a lot of people do think the bill is much better. They took out some of the pork that we didn't need, but they left in disaster relief and some of the key things that we did need. So I would argue that this is a better bill once Elon Musk sent out his X.
So how's Senator Chuck Schumer going to see this ultimately, Christy?
I tend to think that Hakeem Jeffries has more fight in him than Chuck Schumer does. I think that Schumer tends to always want to be a little bit too clever by half and think that, again, that people are going to see his maneuvers as super strategic, when in fact I think it ultimately usually ends up letting the Republicans win. I say this as someone who many years ago worked for Chuck Schumer. So again, I'm not that optimistic that it's ultimately going to be shut down. I think that probably he ends up letting something pass.
Okay, so let's say we get through Friday, there is no shutdown, everybody goes home for the holidays, then we come back, and it's the 119th Congress, and Mike Johnson has to stand for election as Speaker of the House again. Given how all of this has gone down, Sarah, is he going to be able to get the votes?
Right now, I can tell you the Republican Main Street Partnership members stand with him. I do not know if he has the votes. The man deserves to have the votes. I mean, I don't know, first of all, I don't know anybody would want to be Speaker in this environment. But right now, he's done a good job. He went back to the table. He renegotiated. He's come out with a very good, I think, package this time. So I hope he stays. But, there are a few that have already said they're not going to vote for him. So does it take some Democratic, not really votes, but people leaving the chamber and lowering the margin? I don't know. It's going to be an interesting fight in a couple weeks.
Well, Democrats already have acted once to save Speaker Johnson when a motion to vacate came against him for putting Ukraine funding on the floor. Do you think Democrats would do so again in the name of governance that you were speaking of earlier?
I think that is how historically we have felt. And I think, and this is a broader question, as to how much Democrats are going to want to play ball in this administration. I think, some of the moves that we've seen so far with potential nominees is another test of how far are Democrats going to be willing to go. Are we going to be creative and clever about our pushback? Or are we going to play? I actually don't think that Johnson will get Democratic support. And the reason why is obviously there's a different president. Obviously, we had sort of a shared responsibility in making government work as recently as now. Next month, that changes. So I am looking to see, there's a lot of different factors that you kind of want to look to see if, in fact, the tone is changing. And I think it is. I think we're going to be a little more aggressive. I don't see us wanting to play ball as much.
Well, if you're joining us on Bloomberg TV, you see we're showing a live shot of the House floor right now where the Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries is speaking. And there is a sign behind him that says hashtag Republican shutdown. So maybe giving you some indication of how he's feeling ahead of the vote on this continuing resolution this evening. We should point out as well, when we consider what is actually in this package, it's not just about continuing funding for another 3 months or disaster relief. It also lifts the debt ceiling for 2 years, which theoretically clears the deck so that you can enact tax cuts during the first Trump administration. As difficult as the last few days have been, is it actually making the first 100 days of this administration, or the first months of it at least, a lot easier?
That's the hope, absolutely. And why do we keep having this fight? I mean, it's ridiculous. As I said earlier, even Elizabeth Warren agrees with the Republicans that this needs to be lifted. So we'll get tax cuts the first 100 days. I don't think there's any doubt on that either. And the fight's just not worth having. It's a ridiculous fight. And both Republicans and Democrats overspend. It has to go up, once or twice a year to begin with. Why not just put it off the table until 2027?
The debt ceiling increase, is that at least part of this package you can get behind, Christy?
I think that Democrats are going to get behind that. Yeah, I do.
And do you think that they would get behind eliminating it entirely when Donald Trump is president, if he were to still say that that is something he'd like to see?
So, look, I think that overall we need to be looking for concessions from Republican, understanding the math of Congress right now. We know that they need Democratic support for almost anything, right? Especially after some of the members go to their new positions in the administration. There's absolutely no margin for error. So, again, I can see some Democrats getting behind that, but again, not without some significant concession, at least if we're being politically smart about it.
All right, Christy Setzer and Sarah Chamberlain, our political panel this evening. Thank you both so much. And coming up, we'll head back to Capitol Hill for a quick check-in with Bloomberg's Stephen Dennis on what's next for this funding package. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We're awaiting a House vote on the new funding bill that Republicans have put together. And joining me live from Capitol Hill for the latest is Bloomberg's Stephen Dennis. So, Steve, obviously this has been hard fought to this point. What's about to go down?
Yeah, I think we're expecting a vote fairly soon in the House, and I expect that vote to fail. This would be on suspension, which requires a 2/3 vote, when that would mean a lot of Democrats would have to vote for it. And so far, Hakeem Jeffries is a hell no on this package. And, I think most Democrats, if not all of them, are going to vote no. And then you also have a number of conservative Republicans who are likely to vote no, who've never voted for a debt limit increase, or certainly a clean debt limit increase that doesn't cut spending at all. In fact, this bill still has, as far as we can tell, roughly $110 billion in new funding for disasters and farmers, without offsetting that spending with big spending cuts like the conservatives have been demanding. So, that's a recipe for Plan B going down, just like Plan A did yesterday in the face of the wrath of Elon Musk and Donald Trump. The question is whether we then go immediately into negotiations on a Plan C before the government shuts down tomorrow night.
Well, and even in the what seems like the unlikely but could happen scenario that this passes the House, Steve, have we gotten any indication that the Senate would be willing to vote this through?
I think if something actually did get out of the House, there would be a lot of pressure on Chuck Schumer and the Democrats to pass it. This bill basically ripped out, 1,400 pages out of that giant CR package that the Speaker had signed on to. But that 1,400 pages was painstakingly negotiated, included lots of things that both Democrats and Republicans wanted. And there's still a lot of anger over those deals being welched on by the House Republican leadership. And so, typically the way these things work is you just cannot jam the other side on something like this up against a funding deadline. And we saw that 6 years ago, Donald Trump insisted he wanted $5 billion for the wall. The Democrats said no, and we ended up with a 35-day shutdown. I don't know if this is going to go 35 days, but we could certainly have a shutdown this weekend.
Yep, keeping in mind the deadline is midnight tomorrow. Bloomberg's Stephen Dennis live from Capitol Hill, where he has had an incredibly busy day. Thank you so much for joining us, and good luck with the rest of the evening. So we'll see how this goes on the House floor. For more coverage of this funding battle, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. And of course, we'll be back with the latest tomorrow, which is deadline day, right here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.